Richard Caldwell had always believed that a lifetime of hard work guaranteed one thing above all else: security for his family. For more than 40 years, he had built Caldwell Logistics from a single delivery truck into one of the most respected transportation companies in the country. Every late night, every missed holiday, and every difficult decision had been made with one purpose in mind: to give his wife Catherine and their only son David a better life than he had ever known. Richard never regretted the sacrifices. He paid for David's education, supported his career, and proudly watched him rise through the company until he became chief financial officer. When David married Monica, Richard welcomed her into the family without hesitation. He wanted them to build a future together, free from the financial struggles that had shaped his own early years. Only a few weeks earlier, Richard had transferred more than $1 million to help David and Monica purchase their dream home. It was a beautiful estate in an upscale neighborhood outside Chicago. Richard imagined family dinners, grandchildren running through the backyard, and holidays spent together under one roof. That house represented everything he had worked for. The housewarming party seemed like the perfect celebration. Luxury cars lined the driveway. Professional caterers moved through the crowd carrying elegant appetizers. Soft music filled the massive home, while guests admired expensive furniture and custom renovations. Yet, from the moment Richard stepped inside, something felt wrong. David barely spoke to him. Every time Richard tried to start a conversation, Monica appeared out of nowhere and guided David toward another group of guests. It happened once, then again. Then again. Richard told himself he was imagining things. Instead, he quietly watched the room. His attention kept returning to Monica's mother, Beatrice. She behaved as though the house belonged to her. She greeted guests at the front entrance, directed the catering staff, and proudly explained every expensive renovation as if she had personally designed the estate. She carried herself with complete authority. Richard found it strange, but he tried not to judge. Catherine, however, had disappeared upstairs several minutes earlier. When she finally returned, Richard barely recognized the expression on her face. She grabbed his arm so tightly her fingers pressed through his suit jacket. "We need to leave," she whispered. "Right now." Richard frowned. What happened? She didn't answer. Her face had turned pale. Without another word, she guided him through the front door, down the long driveway, and toward their car. Only after the doors were locked did she finally look at him. "Richard," her voice shook. "You didn't read the final property documents yourself, did you?" He stared at her. "No, the attorney handled everything. Why?" Catherine closed her eyes for a moment before answering. "I went upstairs because the downstairs restroom was occupied." Richard waited. "I passed a private office. The door was open." She swallowed hard. "Beatrice was inside, showing something to her friends." What was she showing them? "There was a framed document hanging behind the desk." Richard still didn't understand. "So?" "It was the property deed." He felt the first knot tighten in his stomach. "I walked closer because I thought it was unusual to frame legal paperwork." She looked directly into his eyes. "I read every word." Richard's heartbeat accelerated. The owners were David and Monica. Catherine slowly shook her head. "No." Richard's hands tightened around the steering wheel. "Then whose names were on it?" "It wasn't registered to either of them." Silence filled the car. "It belongs to a company." "What company?" "Kensington Holdings." Richard repeated the name quietly. Kensington. Then realization struck him. Kensington was Beatrice's maiden name. He turned toward Catherine. "Are you absolutely certain?" "I saw the state seal. I saw the registration date. Everything was official." She wiped away a tear. "The company is owned entirely by Beatrice." Richard felt the air leave his lungs. 40 years of work, millions of dollars earned honestly, everything he had sacrificed, and now the house he believed he had purchased for his son legally belonged to someone else. He refused to believe it. "There has to be an explanation." Catherine didn't answer. Instead, she whispered the sentence Richard would never forget. "Richard, I think we just bought Beatrice a mansion." The words echoed inside his mind. For several long seconds, neither of them spoke. Then Richard slowly reached into his jacket, took out his phone, and dialed David's number. His son answered on the third ring. Except, it wasn't David's voice. A familiar laugh came through the speaker. Beatrice. "Oh, Richard," she said with unmistakable satisfaction. "David's busy helping move my furniture into the master bedroom." She laughed again. "Thank you for the wonderful gift." The call ended. Richard stared at the dark screen in complete silence. At that moment, one thought became impossible to ignore. Someone had betrayed him, and he was about to find out who. Richard didn't sleep that night. The moment he arrived home, he went straight to his office and opened his laptop. If Catherine had been right, the truth would be sitting inside public records for anyone willing to look. Within minutes, he found the county property database. He entered the address. The page loaded. Richard felt his stomach drop. The property wasn't registered to David. It wasn't registered to Monica. It wasn't even jointly owned. The legal owner was a limited liability company called Kensington Holdings. He opened the business registry. The managing member listed on the company documents was Beatrice Kensington. No partners, no co-owners, no mention of David, no mention of Monica. Richard printed every document, one page, then another, then another. When the printer finally stopped, a thick stack of papers sat on his desk. The evidence couldn't have been clearer. The money he had transferred had purchased a multi-million-dollar estate that legally belonged to Monica's mother. He placed every document inside a folder. Tomorrow, he wanted answers. Before sunrise, Richard arrived at Caldwell Logistics. Normally, walking into headquarters filled him with pride. Today, he felt nothing. The receptionist greeted him with a smile. He nodded politely but didn't stop. Instead of walking toward his own office, he headed directly to the executive floor. David's office door was closed. Richard opened it without knocking. His son looked up from behind an expensive desk. "Dad?" David smiled. "You're here early. I thought you and Mom were taking the morning off." Richard didn't smile back. He walked across the room and dropped the folder onto the desk. The papers spread across the polished wood. David looked down. His face immediately lost all color. Richard watched every reaction: the widened eyes, the stiff shoulders, the nervous swallow. "You recognize those documents?" Richard asked calmly. David remained silent. Richard pointed at the highlighted page. "My money bought that house." He tapped the owner's name. "So why does your mother-in-law own it?" David finally spoke. "Dad, it's not what it looks like." Richard crossed his arms. "I'm listening." David took a deep breath. "You don't understand how these transactions work." Richard said nothing. "We had to protect the property." "Protect it from what?" "Taxes." David leaned forward, suddenly sounding confident. "Large gifts create tax issues. Monica's accountant recommended placing the property into a temporary holding company." Richard kept staring. David continued. "Kensington Holdings is only temporary. My mother-in-law is acting as trustee. The house will transfer to Monica and me in a few months." Richard had spent decades building companies. He knew corporate structures. He knew tax law. And he knew immediately none of this made sense. Still, he let David continue. "It was simply the smartest financial decision. We were protecting your investment." Richard remained completely expressionless. Just then, the office door opened. Monica walked in carrying 2 coffees. She noticed the documents. Her smile disappeared instantly. "What is going on?" Richard answered before David could. "I'm trying to understand why the house I paid for belongs to your mother." Monica didn't hesitate. Instead of looking guilty, she looked offended. "You searched public records?" Richard stared at her. "I gave you more than $1 million. I think I earned the right to know where it went." Monica folded her arms. It was a gift. Exactly. And gifts don't come with control. Richard couldn't believe what he was hearing. I'm not trying to control anyone. I'm asking a simple question. She shook her head. This is exactly the problem. You don't trust us. You still think we're children. David quickly joined her. Dad, we're adults. You have to let us make our own financial decisions. Richard looked from one to the other. Neither showed the slightest sign of regret. Instead, they acted as though he had done something wrong. Then David opened a cabinet and removed a thick black folder. He placed it on the desk. I'll explain everything. Inside were charts, financial projections, legal terms, tax estimates, and complicated spreadsheets. David pointed to different pages while confidently explaining his so-called strategy. He talked about liability protection, asset management, temporary ownership, future transfers, corporate planning. The presentation sounded impressive. It was designed to overwhelm anyone unfamiliar with finance. But Richard had built companies long before David graduated college. He knew the presentation wasn't explaining the truth. It was hiding it. Every answer created another question. Every explanation avoided the real issue. Most importantly, nothing explained why Beatrice had laughed on the phone. Nothing explained why she proudly called the mansion her gift. Richard stayed quiet. The silence made Monica nervous. She suddenly changed tactics. Her eyes filled with tears. Richard, I can't believe you'd think we'd steal from you. My mother has worked so hard helping us. She's only trying to protect our future. David placed an arm around her shoulders. We wanted to surprise you once everything was finalized. You assumed the worst. You hurt us. Richard watched them carefully. Perfect teamwork. Every sentence rehearsed. Every emotion perfectly timed. Then he made a decision. Arguing would accomplish nothing. If they believed he suspected them, they would become more careful. He needed something different. He slowly lowered his head. His shoulders relaxed. His voice became softer. I'm sorry. David blinked. I overreacted. I suppose I don't understand these modern financial systems anymore. I should have trusted you. The room changed instantly. The tension disappeared. Monica smiled. David let out a relieved breath. It happens, Dad. No hard feelings. Richard nodded quietly. He gathered the papers and turned toward the door. As he reached the exit, the glass reflected David's desk behind him. Richard never looked back directly. He simply watched the reflection. The moment David thought his father had left, he rushed to his computer. Within seconds, he dragged a digital folder into the trash. Richard couldn't read everything, but he clearly saw the folder's name. Caldwell Pension Transfers. Richard kept walking without reacting. Inside, however, he knew this wasn't just about a house anymore. Richard drove home in complete silence. The words Caldwell Pension Transfers echoed in his mind the entire way. A luxury home was one thing. It was betrayal. But if David had touched the company pension fund, this was something far worse. Hundreds of employees had trusted Caldwell Logistics with their retirement. Many of them had spent decades helping Richard build the company from nothing. They weren't just workers anymore. They were family. If their savings had been stolen, Richard couldn't allow another day to pass. He needed proof. Not assumptions, not suspicions. Real evidence. The following afternoon, Richard bought an expensive crystal vase. Anyone watching would think it was a peace offering. That was exactly what he wanted. When he arrived at the estate, the gates were already open. Gardeners were trimming hedges while contractors carried furniture through the front entrance. Richard walked inside without ringing the bell. Voices echoed from deeper inside the house. He followed them quietly. The scene waiting for him stopped him cold. David was on his knees. The chief financial officer of a company worth tens of millions of dollars was measuring the position of a large Persian rug with a tape measure. Standing over him was Beatrice.
"Move it another few inches," she ordered.
"No."
"That's too much."
"Back." David adjusted the rug again.
"I'm sorry." "I'll fix it."
Beatrice rolled her eyes.
"You really can't do anything correctly."
She snapped her fingers.
"Hurry!"
"The designer will be here soon." Richard stood frozen. Yesterday, this same man had confidently lectured him about corporate finance. Today, he looked afraid to disagree over a carpet. There was no confidence, no authority, only obedience. Richard deliberately stepped forward. His shoes clicked against the marble floor. David immediately stood. His face turned bright red. Monica appeared from the kitchen almost instantly.
"Richard?"
"What are you doing here?" Richard smiled politely and raised the vase.
"I wanted to apologize.
I shouldn't have questioned you yesterday."
"I brought a small gift."
Beatrice's expression changed immediately. A satisfied smile spread across her face.
"Now that's much better."
"Leave it over there." Richard placed the vase on a side table. Then he turned toward David. "I have a quick business question." David looked uncomfortable.
"We're still planning to open the new Ohio distribution center before winter, right?"
It was a simple question, one every CFO could answer without thinking. David opened his mouth. Monica interrupted before he could say a single word.
"He's not working today."
Richard looked at David instead. His son lowered his eyes.
"We can discuss it next week."
The answer wasn't important, the reaction was. David wasn't making decisions anymore. Someone else was speaking for him. Someone else was controlling every conversation. Richard nodded. "Of course."
"I'll just use the restroom."
Instead of walking toward the guest bathroom, he quietly continued down the hallway. He remembered exactly where Catherine had seen the office. The door stood open. Richard stepped inside. The room smelled of expensive perfume and leather furniture. Everything was perfectly organized. He searched the desk. Nothing. No documents, no folders, no files. As he turned around, his shoe accidentally touched a decorative trash bin. It tipped over. Several crumpled papers rolled across the hardwood floor. Richard quickly bent down. One page caught his attention immediately. It carried the logo of a luxury casino. He unfolded it. His heartbeat accelerated. The letter wasn't an advertisement. It was a final collection notice. The amount due was enormous. Another paper, another casino, another demand for payment. Every letter carried the same name. Beatrice Kensington. Richard unfolded another page, then another. Every notice warned of overdue gambling debts. Some demanded immediate wire transfers, others threatened legal action. The total reached millions of dollars. Richard finally understood. Beatrice wasn't protecting anyone's investment. She wasn't helping David. She was drowning in debt. And someone was paying those debts. Richard carefully folded every paper exactly as he had found it. He returned them to the trash. Then he quietly left the office. On the drive home, everything began fitting together. The house, the shell company, David's deleted computer folder. Now the casino debts. It wasn't random anymore. It was a pattern. When Richard walked into his kitchen, Catherine immediately knew something had happened.
"What did you find?"
Richard poured himself a glass of water before answering. He told her everything. David obeying Beatrice like an employee, the casino letters, the millions in gambling debt. Catherine covered her mouth.
"Our son."
She struggled to finish the sentence. Richard nodded slowly. "I think he's financing all of it."
"We have to call the police,"
Catherine whispered. Richard shook his head. "Not yet."
"If we accuse him now, he'll erase everything."
"He controls the financial system."
"He controls the records."
"We need evidence no one can deny." That evening, Richard acted exactly as usual. He ate dinner, watched television, spoke casually with Catherine. Then he went to bed. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, he quietly got up, locked himself inside his home office, opened his laptop, and prepared to enter the company network using a secret administrative back door that only one person in the world still remembered: him. Richard closed the office door behind him and sat down in front of his laptop. The room was silent except for the ticking of the old wall clock. For years, David had believed he controlled every financial system inside Caldwell Logistics. After becoming chief financial officer, he had changed passwords, updated security protocols, and restricted access to nearly every department. But David had forgotten one important detail. Richard had built the company long before modern IT departments existed. He had personally approved the original network architecture. More importantly, he had created a hidden administrative access point that had never been removed. It hadn't been used in years. Richard wasn't even sure it still existed. He typed the old credentials from memory. One line, then another. He pressed enter. For several long seconds, nothing happened. Then the screen refreshed. Access granted. Richard leaned back slowly. The back door still worked. He moved past the polished reports David presented at board meetings and opened the raw accounting records instead. Thousands of transactions filled the screen. Fuel expenses, vehicle maintenance, warehouse leases, employee payroll. Everything appeared perfectly normal. David had hidden his tracks well. Richard kept scrolling. Minutes turned into nearly an hour. His eyes burned from staring at numbers. Then, one transaction caught his attention. $30,000 every month, always the same amount. The payment description read, Strategic Logistics Consulting. Richard opened the vendor profile. The consulting company had an ordinary name, nothing suspicious, until he checked the registered address. His hands froze over the keyboard. The address belonged to the apartment where Beatrice had lived before Monica married David. Richard opened the business registration. The company had no employees, no website, no contracts, no history. Only monthly payments from Caldwell Logistics. $30,000 every month, straight into Beatrice's company. Richard felt his jaw tighten. The fake consulting business was nothing more than a pipeline. Company money went in. Beatrice received it. He continued searching. More transfers. More unusual payments. Each one carefully disguised among thousands of legitimate expenses. Someone had spent months making everything appear normal. Richard finally decided he had enough. He clicked the download button. He needed copies before David noticed anything. The progress bar appeared. 1%. 3%. Then suddenly, the screen flashed bright red. A warning window filled the monitor. Unauthorized administrative override detected. Chief Financial Officer has been notified. Richard's heartbeat stopped. David had installed an automatic alert. The moment anyone used the old administrator portal, the system contacted him. Without hesitation, Richard held the power button until the laptop shut down completely. The room went dark. He sat perfectly still. David would receive the notification within seconds. He wouldn't wait until morning. He would come. Richard immediately began preparing. He scattered old retirement documents across his desk, opened several investment folders, placed reading glasses beside the keyboard. Everything needed to look exactly like an elderly businessman struggling with personal finances. When he finished, the room looked harmless. He quietly returned upstairs, lay down beside Catherine, and waited. He never fell asleep. At exactly 6:15 the next morning, a car stopped outside the house. A door slammed. Seconds later, someone knocked loudly, then again, and again. Catherine woke immediately. Richard gently touched her shoulder. "I'll handle it." He put on his bathrobe, ran one hand through his gray hair, then slowly walked downstairs. When he opened the front door, David stood outside. He looked exhausted. His shirt was wrinkled. His eyes were bloodshot. He didn't even wait to be invited inside. "Dad," he said quickly, "we've got a major problem." Richard blinked as though he had just woken up. "What happened?" "Our financial servers were breached during the night." David watched every expression on his father's face.
Someone accessed the company through the old administrator system. Richard frowned. Oh. David stepped closer. The connection came from this house. There was a long pause. Richard lowered his head. I think it was me. David's face tightened. You? Richard sighed heavily. I couldn't sleep. I wanted to check my retirement accounts. I couldn't figure out the new software. So I tried using the old passwords. They still worked. I clicked a few things. Then the screen turned red. I got scared. So I unplugged the computer. I'm sorry. For several seconds, David simply stared at him. Then, the fear disappeared from his face. Relief replaced it. He actually laughed. Dad, you nearly gave me a heart attack. Richard looked embarrassed. I did? I thought we were under a cyber attack. David shook his head. You can't use those old administrator codes anymore. They're dangerous. Richard nodded slowly. I didn't know. David placed a hand on his shoulder. You're getting older. Leave the technology to us. If you ever need financial information again, call my assistant. We'll print everything for you. Richard smiled weakly. You're right. I'll stay away from the computers. David relaxed completely. He believed every word. He believed his father had accidentally stumbled into the system. He believed the danger had passed. He had no idea. Richard had already seen enough to know the truth. The game had changed. And from that moment forward, Richard stopped thinking like a father. He started thinking like the man who had built an empire and knew exactly how to take one apart. Richard drove home without saying a word. Catherine could see the change in his face. The shock was gone. So was the sadness. Something colder had taken its place. When they walked into the house, Richard finally spoke. We're not calling David. We're not confronting Monica. And we're definitely not calling Beatrice. Catherine looked at him in disbelief. After everything we just learned? Richard nodded. If they realize we're onto them, they'll destroy every piece of evidence before sunrise. He placed Thomas's folder on the kitchen table. We only get one chance. The very next morning, Richard began acting differently. Not stronger, weaker. At breakfast, David stopped by unexpectedly. Richard looked at him with a puzzled expression. Good morning, Michael. David frowned. Dad, it's David. Richard blinked several times before forcing a weak smile. Of course. I'm sorry. I don't know why I said your uncle's name. David exchanged a quick glance with Monica. Neither of them spoke, but Richard noticed it. They were watching him carefully, exactly as he hoped. Later that afternoon, Monica visited Catherine with fabric samples for the new house. Richard quietly walked into the kitchen, opened the refrigerator, and placed his car keys beside the milk. A few minutes later, he began searching the entire house. Has anyone seen my keys? I can't remember where I left them. Monica immediately joined the search. Within minutes, she opened the refrigerator. There they are. She lifted the keys and looked toward David with barely hidden excitement. Richard pretended to be embarrassed. I must be getting forgetful. Monica smiled sympathetically. It happens. But Richard saw something else, the satisfaction in her eyes. She wasn't worried. She was collecting evidence. Exactly what he wanted. Every mistake over the next several days was intentional. Richard called people by the wrong names. He forgot simple appointments. He repeated the same stories. He even asked Catherine the same question 3 times during one dinner while David was present. Each performance was carefully planned. Each reaction was genuine. David started speaking more slowly to him. Monica explained simple things as though talking to a child. Beatrice became even bolder. She openly discussed Richard's condition in front of guests. It happens to many people his age. It's heartbreaking. Richard simply nodded. Inside, he memorized every word.
While everyone believed he was falling apart, his real work happened after midnight. Richard met Thomas and a team of attorneys in secure locations across the city. They moved quickly. Every hour mattered. First, Richard transferred his personal investments into protected trusts beyond David's reach. Then they froze every forged document Thomas had discovered. Federal investigators quietly verified Richard's original signatures. The fake paperwork was already beginning to collapse. Next came the company itself. Richard still legally owned Caldwell Logistics. Using that authority, he quietly restructured several key assets without alerting David. Ownership changed. Control shifted. By the end of the week, the company David believed he would inherit looked completely different. If David somehow gained control, he would discover far less than he expected. But Richard still needed one final piece of evidence, something impossible to explain away, something a jury would understand immediately. He decided to build a trap. One Thursday evening, Richard entered his office carrying a blank sheet of official company letterhead. He spent nearly an hour writing. Every sentence looked authentic. When he finished, the document appeared incredibly valuable. Across the top, in bold letters, it read, "Transfer of Chief Executive Authority." According to the document, Richard intended to hand complete control of Caldwell Logistics to David. Every executive power, every banking authorization, every corporate decision. Only one thing was missing: Richard's signature. He deliberately left the signature line blank. Then he placed his favorite gold fountain pen beside the document. Everything looked as though he had simply forgotten to finish signing it. Exactly as planned. Richard wasn't finished. Years earlier, he had installed a tiny security camera inside an old bookcase in his office. Almost no one knew it existed. The camera was smaller than a button. Its view covered the entire desk. Richard connected it to a secure phone that only Thomas could access. Now, every movement inside the office would be recorded. He checked the angle one last time. Perfect. The unsigned document sat directly in the center of the frame. Impossible to miss. That evening, David and Monica stayed for dinner. Richard acted unusually tired. "I don't think I'll stay up much longer." He slowly stood from the table. "I've been working on some paperwork upstairs." He paused intentionally. "I'll finish it tomorrow." He looked directly at David. "Please don't disturb anything in my office." David smiled. "Of course, Dad." Richard nodded and walked upstairs. A few minutes later, he quietly left the house through a private side entrance. Catherine followed, carrying a small overnight bag. Neither of them spoke. A black sedan waited at the end of the street. Thomas was already inside. Within minutes, they arrived at a downtown hotel. Richard opened the secure video feed. The office appeared on the screen. Empty. Silent. The unsigned transfer document rested exactly where he had left it. Catherine squeezed his hand. "Do you really think they'll go inside?" Richard never looked away from the monitor. They won't be able to resist. The room fell silent. Together they waited. For the first move. From the people who believed they had already won. If this story kept you watching until the very end, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. We upload new emotional stories about betrayal, family, justice, and unexpected twists on a regular basis. Every story is carefully adapted and written by hand to bring you the best viewing experience. Leave a comment below and tell us, what would you have done if you were in Richard's place? Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.